are going to the second part of the book of Isaiah. In the last study, the first part, we saw only chapter 1 because we spent quite a lot of time studying or looking at the title, the period of Isaiah, and various other things. And we could only cover chapter 1. So today I hope to cover chapter 2 to 5. So that is the challenge that we have today. So let's move on. Without much ado, let's move on to chapter 2. And chapter 2 opens with a prophecy of hope. But you must have noticed, if you had read this passage, that the chapter 2 also begins with an introduction, a title. It says, chapter 2 verse 1 says, the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Actually, it is a repetition of chapter 1:1, which says the vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. But it is much more elaborate. Chapter 1:1 is more elaborate than 2:1. But this is quite unusual in the Bible. That is a book having two introductions or two titles. This is very unusual. So the book of Isaiah chapter 2 verse 1, why do we have a introduction, another introduction? And it could be, this unusual thing could be because what that passage, chapter 2, 1 to 5, Isaiah chapter 2, 1 to 5, talks about is exactly the same that we found in Micah chapter 4, 1 to 3. Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries. Probably Micah was little younger than Isaiah, but they ministered in the same place during the same time. So Micah chapter 4, 1 to 3, when we looked at it when we studied that book, the book of Micah, and chapter 2 of Isaiah, verse 1 to 5, are very similar. Where there is tremendous verbal, they are same. More than similarity, we can say it is same. So the purpose of the title could be that this is one way of saying that these common prophecy, Micah 4, 1 to 3 and Isaiah chapter 2, 1 to 5, they both, actually Isaiah is the real author of that. Maybe a way of saying, clarifying that this is Isaiah's prophecy which Micah might have incorporated into his prophecy. And so it could be that way of making clear who is the original author or who is the original prophet. And they lived in the same period. It is still possible that this came from the same source, a common source that they both knew. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on chapter 2 verses 1 to 5 because that passage was already taken up. We studied it in detail when we studied Micah chapter 4. So I'm just going to skip it because they are same. So please go back to your notes on Micah chapter 4 for this purpose. So we'll not be wasting our time on that. So I jump to the next section, chapter 2 verses 6 to chapter 4 verse 1. This passage, so Isaiah chapter, the first 5 verses of Isaiah of chapter 2 is a word of hope for Judah. That is, there is coming a distant future called latter days. Isaiah himself doesn't know, but latter days simply means that a period after his lifetime or a distant future there will be global peace, global prosperity, and the land of Jerusalem or the city of Jerusalem will be a place that every nation will seek to be there, and the word of the Lord will change the people. And that's what we saw in Micah, and same here as well. But in chapter 2, 6 onwards, the whole thing changes. God continues to condemn the people for their ungodly, wicked, and sinful ways. So we look at chapter 2, 6 to 22 first. We'll take up small units. So chapter 2, 6 to 22 lists two things. It lists. One is it lists the sins, the wickedness of the people of Jerusalem. And God says in chapter 2, 6, first thing that God is not pleased is that they are full of fortune tellers. Let me read chapter 2, verse 6. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east, and fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of foreigners. What this passage, without going into all the nitty-gritties of the passage, this is a condemnation of the people for accommodating or using the services of fortune tellers and maybe tarot card readers and people who can maybe palmistry, astrologers, and all that. So the East is known as, in the Bible, East is known as a place of wisdom or a place of sages. You know, in Jesus' time, the wise men came from the East, and they followed a star, which means they were astrologers. They were watching the stars. And why God is against all these practices? People who read and tell your future. People will look at your face and tell your future. Few people will are fortune tellers, whichever way. You know, tarot card readers and all sort of things. Why is God against that? Why God condemns such practices? One simple thing, or maybe one or two things that I can point out. One, God doesn't want people to be anxious about their future. God's people. God don't want God's people to be anxious of their future. You know why? Because He want His people to believe that their future is secure with Him. Where do you get anxiety? Where do anxiety come from? Anxiety come from when we are not certain about our future. But that is okay with the Gentiles. That is okay with people who do not know the living God, who worship idols. You know why? Because they don't know the future. Now you will see this theme developed in the rest of the book of Isaiah very, very strongly. Number two, whatever the future is. Say for example, now you read a horoscope in the daily newspaper. You know your star, and so you went and read your horoscope in the newspaper, and see that horoscope people, most of them are false. Say it says that you are going to lose a lot of money this week. So that frightens you, because if you believe in the horoscope and the person who wrote that horoscope, who prophesied about that. But now if you come to chapter 40 onwards, when we come, or an astrologer looking at your star said your star is going to enter a new phase and it is going to be disastrous, someone in the family is going to die and things like that. But the book of Isaiah says in the later chapters, I will elaborate when I come to those chapters more on this. He says, now God is in control of the stars. He created the stars. He even challenges, lift your eyes and see who created all these stars, who makes them parade, and he calls the names of the families of the stars, the group of stars, and things like that. So we should not be fooled. God's people should not be fooled so easily that if a star combination changes, that is going to have a disastrous or even positive effect on our life. You know why? Because we believe, that is God's people believe, that the stars are created by God and God is in control of the stars. So this is the problem. This is the sin. Instead of trusting in God who created the stars and who has appointed stars to be in the places that he has allotted them, who has charted the movement of the stars, the course of the stars, if people don't believe in that God, they tend to believe in other things. But believing in other things like fortune tellers and palm readers, astrologers, and all the sort of things that you can think of is basically a sin, because it shows the lack of trust in the Creator God, who creates new things, and he knows the beginning, he knows the end from the beginning, and he's an omniscient God, all-powerful God. So that is why is Judah's guilt is having fortune tellers and all that sort of practices. The Philistines were well known for this craft. Among the Philistines, they would take Philistines from the western coast or who are living among them, making a living by telling or writing horoscopes and other things. A second sin is the trust in the weaponry. Their land, verse 7. I am reading verse 7. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Now, when we come to later chapters, I had already told you that chapters 1 to 5 is a summary or is just a appetizer of what Isaiah prophesied and elaborately in a very extensively in the later chapters. So here we have, God says that these people have filled their land with money and horses and chariots. In a period of crisis when they felt that Assyria is going to attack them, King Hezekiah sent a lot of money and also diplomats to Egypt to buy horses and chariots. That comes after chapter 30 in book of Isaiah. So their land is prepared. They are ready for war. They are ready to face the threat from Assyria or any army, because they have stocked enough horses and chariots. They have amassed a lot of wealth, silver and gold, to spend on the army. So that is a sin. That's a sin. So as I said in the later chapters, we will see this in detail. Because God asked them to trust in Him, nothing else. He even warned in later chapters, he even warned them or told them, see, the horses of the Egyptians are flesh, they are not spirit. He told them, because there is no point, you don't have to go, because I will protect Jerusalem. Like a bird hovers over Jerusalem. I am like a lion. I will protect Jerusalem. So why do you need these things? Why do you need this so much of weaponry, so much of ammunition? Why you need all sort of chariots and things like that? Because I am your God. Trust and obey. So this is another sin. This is also lack of trust. You know why? Because they have bought chariots, they have acquired chariots and horses simply because they don't trust God, who is able to protect them. So that is their guilt. And then the third guilt is idolatry. Much more specific. Their land, verse 8, chapter 2, book of Isaiah chapter 2 verse 8. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. Now, in addition to all these things, they have idols all over the place, all over their country, all over their land, because they found worshipping the idols better than or more preferable to trusting in the invisible God. Though God is invisible, He is capable of protecting them because they are His people. So this is again a lack of trust in God. They resorted to trust the idols who have eyes but they don't see, have mouth but can't speak, have ears but can't hear. Now these three sins, major sins, God says you will be punished for that. That is the concern in the next verse, following verses. Book of Isaiah chapter 2 verses 9 to 22. It details the punishment that they are going to have for these sins. Trusting in the weapons instead of trusting in God. Trusting in the fortune tellers instead of trusting in the God who has already ordained who knows our destiny. That anxiety, that curiosity is dangerous, sinful curiosity. And the punishment is that God is going to send judgment in such a way that they will have to run to look for hiding. They will have to go into hiding to escape the terror of God. Chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And I will read only verse 10. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of His majesty. God is coming now, He says, to judge them. And when He comes in all His glory and splendor, they will not be able to stand it. So they will have to go to the caves. They will have to go to holes in the cliffs, rocks. And sometimes when there is no rock around to hide from the splendor and the majesty of the Lord, they will have to make holes in the ground and hide themselves in the holes, in the dust. So there is this, the way that is expressed, that is, nobody can escape the anger, the wrath of God against the sinful people. And then the remaining verses, you can read this, but we can't go verse by verse. But here, God says chapter 2, 12 onwards, till the end of that chapter. Now God narrates what are the things He is going to destroy. You will see references to trees, ships of Tarshish, and fortifications. This doesn't mean that God is going to destroy the oaks of Bashan or the cedars of Lebanon. Now God is not taking up His anger against them. But God says these are all symbols of pride and false power. All this, the trees of Lebanon and the Bashans of oak, He says, I have a day against all that, means whoever thinks that they are the most prominent, most important, they are the greatest, like the proud trees of the majestic trees of Lebanon. Lebanon is a very what you can say, green country. Not only green, but it is famous for its tall cedars. And Bashan, in a similar way, is also very famous for the big, huge oak trees. Some people think God, that is what God says in that passage. Some people think that they are like these majestic trees which doesn't fall in the wind. Even in an earthquake they may survive. Then he goes on to say that he is against the ships of Tarshish. The ships of Tarshish simply means deep sea vessels. In ancient world there were at least two types of ships. Vessels in this sense means ships. One type is the coasting vessels. Coasting vessels are, if a good comparison in India would be a ship that leaves the port of Mumbai and goes to Goa. It is along the same shore, and from Goa it goes down to Mangalore, and then from Mangalore it goes to Kochi, and from Kochi maybe to Trivandrum. It goes further down, but it is along the coast. It goes along the coast. It doesn't venture into deep sea. But if a ship that leaves Mumbai and is heading towards, say for example, New York, crossing the Atlantic, passing through Atlantic, that is called a deep sea vessel. And a deep sea vessel is strong. Deep sea vessel is a matter of pride for those people because it is strong enough. It can carry a lot of things, people and goods across the deep troublesome sea. But God says here, now I will destroy the ships of Tarshish. Now simply this is a symbolic way of saying, whoever thinks that you can achieve things by your own strength, you can do whatever you can do with your own strength, such pride and arrogance, I am coming against it because of your sins listed above. Then a third thing that God says He is against are fortifications. That I would take more literally, because the kings of Judah and Israel, they were fortifying their various places against the enemy, so that the enemy cannot destroy them or come against them, conquer them and all that. So we can see they are still unearthing a lot of fortifications along in Judah, archaeologists. So these fortifications are, they mean that the people, the king, the rulers of their nation are strong, they are powerful, and they can withstand any enemy attack. But that also is against trusting in God. Now, God is not against people building fortresses, but He says if it comes out of insecurity, not able to believe in God or trust God or give God in charge, God the charge of your life, then it's a substitute for God. It is sin and God is going to destroy. We'll see later in the book. We'll read about the campaign of the Assyrian emperor Sennacherib. This prophecy is fulfilled literally. The Sennacherib has recorded that he had conquered 40 fortified cities in the land of Judah. One of the strongest fortification was Lachish, and that also fell to the Assyrians. So here God says, and it was fulfilled in the time of Isaiah. Before Isaiah died, he had to see these fortifications being pulled down by the enemy, because God had abandoned His people who did not trust Him for their destiny, who did not trust them for their security, God who did not trust Him their prosperity. God comes against them. A very powerful, strong word of prophecy, a word of judgment, which literally took place. Now, the punishment continues in the next chapter, but the tone is slightly different. In chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, though in the previous chapter, the end of chapter 2, God has spoken metaphorically about trees and ships and fortifications. Here he is talking about, that is too general, isn't it? More specific. God says, the punishment is, number one, I'm going to remove the leadership who runs the nation. The leadership will be removed. Not only removed, I will replace it with immature leadership. That is the first punishment. Verses chapter 3, book of Isaiah chapter 3 verses 1 to 5. I think I should read all the 5 verses. So please turn with me to these first 5 verses of chapter 3. For behold, the Lord of hosts is taking away from Jerusalem and from Judah support and supply, all support of bread and all support of water. Is he talking about a famine? Probably a famine. And it may not be a literal famine. It may be the removal of all support of administrative support, maybe bureaucratic support, so that to run the country in a proper way. That is what he is talking about. If you read verses 2 onwards, probably verse 2 is an explanation of verse 1. And who is the staff of bread, support of bread and support of water? The mighty man and the soldier, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and elder, the captain of the 50 and the man of rank, the counselor and the skillful magician, and the expert in charms. Now, this is a full list of the government machinery. How will the government run? These are the people, the army, the counselors, and people who would seek the divine will, whether to go to war or not to go to war. The counselors of the entire government machinery, people who run the government machinery are listed there. And God says, I am going to remove all this. And verse 4, and in the place of these experts of people who knew the statecraft well, because they did not trust God, I am going to replace them with immature leadership, very juvenile leadership. And I will make boys their princes, and infants shall rule over them. Children will take control. Immature young man, like Solomon, died in a good old age, but his son took care of. This is a distant past. His son Rehoboam took over the reins of Israel, but he was so immature. He messed up, and it led to the division of the kingdom. In a similar way, God is going to make immature leadership to be in charge. And not only that, there will be civil war. Verse 5, and the people will oppress one another, everyone his fellow, everyone his neighbor. The youth will be insolent to the elder, and the despised to the honorable. Now the whole social order is going to mess up, because people are going to fight with each other. Now usually this happens when there is a famine. When there is, so you might have seen people, or at least read news, that in refugee camps, when the food supply is less, people steal each other's food. And because there is not enough food to go around or enough water to go around, there will be quarrel about these places. And the neighbors will fight when there is such shortage of food and clothes and shelter and all that sort of thing. And there will be no respect. the whole social order will collapse. Why? That is because that is this for the judgment, the punishment for their sin. Now, it goes on to say, come back to the sin again. In verse 4, before I come to that, now chapter 4 verse 1 gives us another sad picture. When God sends His judgment on them, the population of men will be decimated. Most of the men will be killed, or they will be taken into exile in such a way that there will not be enough men for the women to marry. That is, the men-women ratio will be very badly affected. To what extent? There will be one man for 7 women. Now, don't take all this literally. These are all symbolic way of saying how grave, how serious, and how sad this judgment is, the impact of the judgment on the people of Israel. Chapter 4 verse 1. And 7 women shall take hold of one man in that day, saying, We will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach. The picture is, the husband is supposed to, in ancient societies particularly, the husband is supposed to provide food and clothing and shelter for the women he marries. Sometimes they will marry more than one woman. So they will have, sometimes say just one also. So even if one or more, the man should provide for them. But when God judges them for their sins, there will be a situation there. 7 women will catch hold of one man and say, don't have to have, but just allow us to be called your wife or wives. To be unmarried woman is a reproach. So please take the shame away. So if we can simply say that we are the wife of this man. So the male population will be so decimated, so annihilated, and such a sad situation will arise in Judah. All for their sins. Since their sin is expressed in their lifestyle. What you wear is also an expression of who you are. What you are, not who you are. What you are. We wear our attitude, isn't it? We show off. And it is not against dressing properly, carrying yourself in a decent manner. But when our lifestyle, what we possess, becomes symbols of pride and arrogance, God will take it away from us. Chapter 3, verses 18 onwards. There's 8 verses I'm not going to read. But that is what the summary of those 9 verses are. Let me read a few verses, the first few verses. Chapter 3, 18 to 26. In that day, the Lord will take away the finery of the anklets, headbands, and the crescents, what they wear on their forehead, the pendants, the bracelets, and the scarves, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets, the signet rings and the rose rings, the festal robes, the mantles, the cloaks, and the handbags. This is the long shopping list, isn't it? The mirrors, that you can look up, the makeup mirrors, the linen garments, and the turbans, And the veils, instead of perfume, there will be rottenness. Instead of a belt, a rope. The belts that they ordered from Mahindra, that will be replaced when God judges with a rope to carry them to a foreign country as slaves. And instead of well-set hair, baldness, the enemy will shave them off their hair. Instead of a rich robe, a shirt of sackcloth, they will be forced to wear the slave's cloth. A branding instead of beauty. And they will be branded, they will use some hot metal to number them, 1, 2, 3 and all that. Instead of beauty, your men shall fall by the sword, and your mighty men in battle, and the gates and lament and mourn. Now it's very sad. But don't misunderstand that God is against good living. No. But when that becomes symbols of pride and arrogance and defiance of God, God will take that away. That is the message to them. And that literally happened in 597 when the first deportation. Because this lifestyle is arrogance, is a manifestation of their arrogance, their pride against or lifting themselves above the Creator God. And as we might have always noted, after this very gloomy picture, very hopeless picture, the prophets always had words of hope. Chapter 4 verses 2 to 6 is a word of hope. The punishment will take place, but God will not destroy them completely. He has a word of hope. Let me go verse by verse through this very, very important passage in the book of Isaiah. Chapter 4 verse 2 opens. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. He is talking about two things. We may be easily misled by the word branch of the Lord to be agricultural, to be the prosperity of the land. That is the second part. The branch of the Lord comes again in the prophetic books, even in this book. It calls the branch of Jesse, shoot of Jesse and all that. When we come to that chapter, we looked at chapter 12, chapter 9, chapter 11. These are all called the Messianic Prophecies. Here is a hope that one day God is going to raise a righteous, godly Messiah. That is the branch of the Lord. That same expression, a similar expression comes in the book of Jeremiah, in various other places, even in Isaiah many times. The branch is the Messiah to come, the Christ, the anointed to come. When He comes, the land will have prosperity. Though the food, the staff of bread and the support of food, water will be taken away as punishment, when the Messiah comes, there is going to be prosperity. For whom? For the remnant, those who return to Him. So after the punishment, some people will be left behind, but they will return to God. There is a prosperity coming. Chapter 4 verses 2 to 3. And he who is left in Zion, Zion simply means Jerusalem, and remains in Jerusalem, they say the same thing in two different ways, will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. Now after the aftermath, when the dust settles after the destruction of Jerusalem, There will be some people who survive the devastation. And God is going to send them a Messiah, a Savior, a leader. And they will return. God has a plan for them. They will return to God. But the following verses clarifies that not just as they are, but the Lord is going to sanctify them. The Lord will purify those survivors and cleanse Jerusalem of all the sins and their wickedness. Let me read chapter 4 verses 4 to 6. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion. Daughters of Zion is an expression for the citizens of Jerusalem. And cleanse the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and a spirit of burning. God is going to bring a baptism of fire which will purify them. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion. Mount Zion means the mount of the Temple Mount, Jerusalem, and over the assemblies a cloud by day and a smoke and shining of a flaming fire by night, and over all the glory there will be a canopy, and there will be a booth of shade by the day and the heat. Now this reminds me of the early days of Israel, when they had no protection, when they did not know the way, when they were wandering in the wilderness after leaving or crossing Jordan after being delivered from the Pharaoh's hands. God led them by a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud during the day. God says, now, after the judgment is over, once the smoke of the fire that burns from the city, various buildings in the city, when that settles down, I'm going to keep a remnant who will be blessed by a Messiah, and I will guide them, or I will be kind to them, gracious to them, as I did to their forefathers when they wandered 40 years in the wilderness. I will be compassionate again. I will be their shepherd again. I will be their God again. I will protect them after I have purified them. What a glorious promise of God. Now, that is the theology of suffering. Whether we invite our sufferings or whether God sends a discipline to purify us, to discipline us, God will not destroy us. God has a plan for those who return to Him. Plan to be their Savior again, their provider again, their leader again, and to shepherd them through this wilderness of our worldly pilgrimage. That is what God promises. We come to chapter 5. Chapter 5, 1 to 7 is a beautiful poem. A poem where the singer is Prophet Isaiah himself. Chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. The poem opens like this. Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. So probably Prophet Isaiah says, I'm going to sing a song of love, a love song for my beloved. Beloved is God. And this actually echoes the main ethos of Psalm 80 verses 8 to 6, which talks about God bringing a vine and planting it in a land, clearing all the other trees and shrubs and things like that, and how this vine spread its wings, branches, but finally God had to destroy it. So you can read Psalm 80 verses 8 to 16 later. It talks about God the lover, Isaiah's lover, Isaiah's beloved. God planted a vineyard on a fertile slope. Usually the vineyards are planted on fertile slopes which are fertile, slopes where there will be what you call, the water will drain away. That is the best land, best place to plant vineyards. And he had a lot of hope. He dug it, he cleared it of stones, and he brought the best wine. The best wine was planted there, and he built a watchtower in the midst. He had so much of hope, so he had a wine press and a wine vat in it, and he looked for grapes, good grapes, because the wine he planted was good, so it should give good grapes. But unfortunately, it disappointed him. It yielded wild grapes. It's a parable, it's an allegory about Israel. How God chose them from other nations, how he cared for them, how he loved them, and the hope that he had in them, that they will be fruitful for him. But it didn't take place. They disappointed them. And then God proclaims the judgment. Verses 5 to 6. And now I tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. It will break down its I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down, and I will make it a waste, and shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns will grow up. Basically, now he says this is an allegory. In this allegory, God says, I am going to abandon this vineyard. I am going to remove the protective fence. I will let all the wild animals to trample it, and it will be completely destroyed. This is a very poetic way of saying what Isaiah had already said so far, that God is going to abandon his people for being absolutely useless. He had hopes in them. God wanted them to be a light unto the nations, but they could not. Instead of being a light unto the nations, they allowed the nations to guide their destiny. They went to Philistines to seek astrologers and fortune tellers. They went to Egypt to buy horses and chariots so that they don't have to depend on the power of God. God says, this vineyard has disappointed me, so I'm going to remove its protection. That is what happened. Now, chapter 5 is chapter 5 verses 8 to 30. The last 22 verses or 23 verses closes with the introductory part, chapters 1 to 5, with 6 woes. What is a woe? A woe is a sort of a lamentation that you see in your mind, or foresee the devastation or the negative or the adversity that is going to befall, and you start weeping. That is why it is called a woe. There are 6 woes, and with that I will close today. First of all, he says, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no room. The first woe is against people who amass or keep on buying estates, plots of land, so that they can live in the midst of their huge estate, all alone, completely detached from others. But living in large estate is not the issue, because to have a large estate, you have to plunder the poor. So the poor will be deprived of their land. You will attach the land of the poor people. They will be dispossessed. So that is the sin. You grow your estate, you enlarge your estate at the expenses of people who are not privileged. Probably they will be selling their land to you because they have become bond servants, because of the exploitative, oppressive systems that you promote. That is the first woe. The second woe is against drunkenness and indulgence. People who have forgotten God and God's grace in their life, they are given to drunkenness. They have no time to pray, they have no time to worship, they have no time to seek God's will or God's glory. They get up in the morning only to drink. See verse 11. Woe to those who rise up early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, and tarry late into the evening, as wines inflates them. Drunkenness is ignoring God. So the picture is, people get up early in the morning, start drinking, and they keep on drinking till late night. They have lost touch with the reality. They allow themselves to be intoxicated, and they do all that sort of wickedness. They forget God. And Isaiah says, the prophecy says, the word of God says, woe to those people, because they are going to have a miserable end. And the third woe is people who are cynical. Those who ignore God and who completely has no regard. Verse 18. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as with cart ropes. They just invite, they just drag iniquity into their life, and they defy God. They are very cynical. Verse 19. Who say, let him be quick, that is God. Let him speed up his work, that we may see it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw near, and let it come, that we may know it. They are challenging God. When Isaiah prophesied about punishment that is coming, these people cynical about God and what God has already prophesied, they are challenging God. Let the Holy One Israel do what he wants to do. Let him come against us. We will see. He says he cannot. They are defying God. They are defying God, that God cannot do anything to punish them. So for those people, Isaiah says, woe to them, because they are going to suffer for their cynicism. The next woe in chapter 5 verse 20 is who are morally blind. What is moral blindness? Moral blindness is when we cannot see things as the way they are. When we call an evil thing good thing. When we call darkness light. When we call bitterness sweet. And the other way as well. See, moral blindness is where the values are completely topsy-turvy, upside down. Verse 20, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and night for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. They don't care. When there is murder, they justify the murder. When there is rape, they justify the rape. Exploitation, they have some way of just thinking it is right. They are morally blind. Woe to them, because they are going to have serious, all their actions are going to have serious adverse consequences from God. The fifth woe is against those who glorify themselves instead of glorifying God. Verse 21, chapter 5:21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Now they think there is no one wiser than them. They think they can decide for themselves. When they have access to the Creator's wisdom, they live by their own wisdom. They glorify themselves. People who lead their life by the strength or the power of their tiny brain, completely trusting in them, they are going to have very negative, adverse punishment. And seeing that by prophetic eyes, what is going to the devastation that is going to them, Isaiah says, woe to those people. And finally, the sixth woe is against those who are, again, one more time it repeats, drunkenness. And out of drunkenness, they involve in bribery. Verse 22, woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine. Have you come across people who can say, I can take 2 pegs, still it doesn't affect, I can stand straight on my feet. And valiant men in mixing strong drink. These alcoholics, they're so proud that they know how to make all these cocktails, alcoholic cocktails. And then, not only that, they acquit the guilty for a bribe. Very common thing. To get money, the judge or the lawyer will take bribe and completely subvert justice and deprive the innocent of his right. And that's what's happening in our courts, even in our government offices, even now. For money, to lead a drunken life, to do all that is illegal, they grab money, they take bribe. And God says, woe to them. Woe is a lament, seeing or knowing the punishment that is going to happen to them. The first 5 chapters ends with that. The gory picture of the punishment, the judgment that is going to happen to Israel. But in that passages, this section also, we see glimmer of hope. That is, God is going to have sometime in the latter days, there is hope, prosperity, not just for Israel, global peace, global prosperity, end of wars, and knowledge of God will spread as the waters cover the sea. And in that we see the glimmer of hope again, the day of the Messiah, where God will purify a remnant for him. The people of God will rise like the phoenix from the ashes again. But God's heart pleads with his people. Looking at the devastation, he utters woes, he laments. That is, horrible things are going to happen unless you turn back to God. Now, that's the message that Isaiah had to carry to his people. But it all happened. He had to carry this because God called him to this rather uncomfortable ministry. In chapter 6, that we will look at next week, we will be looking at that chapter. The call of Isaiah and how Isaiah was commissioned to preach God's word, or to be God's spokesperson. That is what made the prince not to look for a royal appointment in the court, but to be considered despised, rejected, but to be the spokesperson of God, of Yahweh. And we'll see that in the next week. Until then, so we have to wind up the study today. And God be with us.